The watchman at the gates is a powerful image, but of course, the defense of Jerusalem does not begin at its gates. And guarding Jerusalem is not simply a matter of physical strength. It requires spiritual commitment and wisdom as well. Indeed, defenders of Zion require a greater mix of physical and spiritual strength than any defenders of any spot on earth. Both our recent and ancient history as a people is one of continuous testament to this truth. And it is this aspect of Jerusalem, the eternal and temporal front line of the Jewish people, that I wish to discuss with you tonight. If you drove to Jerusalem this evening from Tel Aviv, as the coastal plain suddenly ended 25 kilometers from the city at Shar Hagai, or what used to be known as Bab el Wad, you reached the starting point of the siege of Jerusalem in 1947. It was from this gauntlet that the British-commanded Jordan Legion sought, with the help of the Arabs in Jerusalem and surrounding villages, to cut the Jews of the city off from the rest of the country, and so to conquer the nascent Jewish state. As you began ascending through the hills to Jerusalem, you could see the remnants of some of the most fearsome and bloody battles of the war. They came in the form of the reverentially preserved hulks of the armored personnel carriers used by Haganah and Palmach units sent in front of Jordanian snipers in a continuous attempt to bring reinforcement and food to the besieged Jews of Jerusalem. As the hills, covered on both sides with JNF forests, rose to meet you, you passed the Latrun fortress on your right. It was the British decision to transfer control over Latrun, with its command over the road below, to the Jordan Legion that all but guaranteed the fall of Jerusalem by preventing reinforcements from aiding its undermanned defenders. Yet wave after wave of Jewish soldiers threw themselves against the guns of the Jordan Legion in a desperate attempt to break its chokehold on Jerusalem. If you came to this hotel from the center of town, you may have gone by Davidka Square. There you would have passed by one of the primitive mortars used by the Harel Brigade in the battle for Jerusalem. The Davidka was a grossly ineffective killing machine, but between its thunderous noise and the rumor mill, it proved an effective tool of psychological warfare against the enemy. Even more than in traditional conflicts, the psychological aspect of the War of Independence played a pivotal role in determining the outcome. The Jews, who just 3 years before had been incinerated in European crematoria, were an object of wonder, no less than hatred for our enemies. Like the phoenix rising from the ashes, for many Arabs there was a sense that supernatural powers were at work as the new Jewish state rose from the ruins of Jerusalem. For their part, schooled in the martial traditions of Joshua and Gideon, the Jews of 1948 blended seamlessly the psychological and the metaphysical with armor and steel. The Davidka monument is just as much a reminder of what this uniquely Jewish military doctrine can achieve as the unwalled city of Jericho. If you came this way from the old city, you most likely walked through the Jewish quarter. It was to the 1,700 Jews who lived there in 1948 and their 150 defenders that the eyes of the citizens of the nascent Jewish state were turned. The future security of the country was dependent on their ability to withstand the Arab siege. They had to be assisted, and they had to hold their ground if the war was to end in a resounding victory for the Jews. Tragically, in 1948, the spiritual strength that sustained us was not matched by sufficient physical strength to hold the city. As Jerusalem commander Dov Yosef instructed the starving and desperate Jews within the walls about the nutritional benefits of various leaves that they could eat in the absence of food, and as wave after wave of Jewish fighters fell to their deaths on the roads ringing the city, at Latrun, at the Castle, at Har Adar, and Gush Etzion, in their bid to relieve the Jerusalemites, the British-commanded Jordanians delighted in our suffering. Arab snipers picked off any Jew within range. In the end, the Jews of the old city held out for 6 months. Last week marked the 61st anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem on May 27th, 1948. Of the Jewish quarter's 150 defenders, only 43 survived until the Churva synagogue was destroyed by the Jordan Legion. It was the destruction of the venerable old synagogue that finally forced the hands of the rabbis within the walls. After the Chorva was destroyed, the rabbis began negotiating the surrender of the old city to the Arabs. If you walked to the King David Hotel today from the old city and exited through the Jaffa Gate, you certainly took note of the gentrified neighborhood of Mamila. Today, as you walk through the new upscale shopping plaza, it is hard to believe that from May 27, 1948 to June 7, 1967, Mamila was Israel's front line. It was Sderot and Kiryat Shmona of its time. The Jews of the neighborhood lived in constant fear of Jordanian snipers who took potshots from the walls of the conquered city at the Jews down below. The buildings you passed were once surrounded by sandbags. The Jews who lived inside them would run, not walk, as they crossed the street. Any hesitation could spell their death. But then, on the third day of the Six-Day War, their long nightmare ended. After 19 years, the IDF succeeded in liberating the capital city. Paratroopers from kibbutzim danced with yeshiva buchers as they stood in awe before the remnant of the Second Temple. In June 1967, the proper balance between our spiritual and physical defenses had finally been struck. After 2,000 years, we were again a free people. 18 years ago, on May 27, 1991, the 43rd anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem and the 24th anniversary of its liberation, tens of thousands of Jews from Ethiopia were airlifted to the Jewish state. As then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said, the Ethiopian Aliyah marked the first time in history where Africans were liberated from slavery by being taken out of Africa. The entire city celebrated the arrival of these Jews who had maintained their allegiance to Zion for thousands of years, often in complete isolation from the rest of the people of Israel. The next day, May 28, 1991, I stepped off an El Al plane at Ben Gurion Airport, and before reaching the passport check, I walked up the stairs of the old terminal building to the Ministry of Absorption's offices and officially made Aliyah. A friend picked me up and my massive immigrant suitcases, and a few hours later, I began my new life in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem that greeted me 18 years ago was almost entirely free from fear. It was hard for me to imagine that the city had ever been endangered as I rode the buses, walked along the streets, sat in cafes, hiked in the forest, shopped in the supermarkets and clothing stores. As I moved without fear through the Arab neighborhoods and traversed the old and new city without a thought, it rarely occurred to me that I was walking on contested ground. The Palestinian uprising, which had begun in 1988, had instigated a period of self-segregation and renewed hostility towards Israel among the city's Arab residents. But it had been defeated in the wake of the Gulf War. Unbeknownst to me and my fellow Jerusalemites, all of this was set to change just 2 years later, when, as part of the implementation of the Oslo peace process with the PLO, the government of Israel allowed for an Arab armed force to be deployed on the outskirts of the city. Fear returned to Jerusalem. Within just a few weeks of the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994, Jerusalem again became the front line of the country as terrorists from Ramallah, Hebron, Beit Lechem, and beyond converged on Jerusalem to terrorize its people in shooting attacks and suicide bombings. What the people of Sderot experienced today was first suffered by residents of Gilo. I moved away from Jerusalem in 1991 after I joined the army. I returned to the city in 2002. By that time, the sense of safety I had felt during my first months in the country had been obliterated. Every day brought a new atrocity or attempted atrocity. My own street became the scene of carnage as a bus was bombed just half a block from my front door. My neighbors' mangled bodies were strewn before me as I ran out of my home in some vague notion that I could help somebody. While there was no hunger among the city's residents in 2002, as there had been during the siege of 1948, the chronic, continuous sense that at any moment you could be killed filled the air with similar dread and foreboding. It was only after the government finally unleashed the Israel Defense Force in Judea and Samaria that a semblance of normality returned to the city. It was only after Operation Defensive Shield returned our soldiers to the streets of Ramallah and Beit Lechem, Shechem, Jenin, Kalkilia, and Hebron, and vastly curtailed the powers of the Palestinian armed forces that we could feel safe again going out to dinner and riding the bus. During the years that Jerusalem came under physical threat, it also became politically threatened. Israel's acquiescence to the PLO's military presence on the outskirts of the city began a process of unraveling Israel's own claim to the city. As Yasser Arafat ordered his forces to march on Jerusalem and denied that the Jewish people have any rights to the city, successive Israeli governments found themselves on the diplomatic defensive. Just as our leaders allowed Jerusalem's physical well-being to be threatened, so they enabled its political unity to come under assault. Rather than insist that the world recognize our sovereign rights to our capital at best, our leaders spoke of the strategic importance of Jerusalem to our physical security. The element of metaphysical power embodied in the tactically worthless Davidka was absent from discussions of how Israel needed Sur Bacher and Jabal Mukaber to defend Armon HaNatziv, or how our control over Shoafat and Beit Hanina is necessary to defend Ramot, Neve Yaakov, and Pisgat Ze'ev. Happily, today Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat have abandoned this defensive posture and are waging strident campaigns against all who demand that we again surrender our eternal capital. But for much of the past 15 years, the full expanse of Jewish history and identity was narrowed to a discussion of isolated neighborhoods, as if they were what this is all about. Jerusalem's importance is far greater than the sum total of its neighborhoods, and in ignoring this basic truth, our leaders did more to imperil the city's neighborhoods than legions of our enemies could hope to accomplish. And even more devastating than what we said to the world is what we said to ourselves. For much of the past 15 years, our national leaders scornfully and contemptuously worked to limit our expectations and accused us of being greedy for assuming that we had a right to our capital. When did King David live in Abu Dis, they sneered. Why were we needlessly upsetting the Arabs by moving back to Ir David, they hissed. The underlying message was clear. We were provoking our enemies by asserting our rights, which, we were told, were unimportant anyway. In general, since 1994, to greater and lesser degrees, our leaders abandoned Jerusalem as our metaphysical front line and reduced the rationale of our control over our eternal capital to a security argument. This argument, by the way, is fine as far as it goes. We explained correctly that without Israeli control over Jerusalem, the entire country would be under threat. And this is true. In fact, it's always been true. Among other reasons, King David chose Jerusalem as his capital city because of its strategic importance. Were foreign forces to take control over Jerusalem and surrounding areas today, everything from Ben Gurion Airport to Tel Aviv, to Beersheba to Tiberias would be placed under threat. As Shara Gai in 1948 and Beit Jala in 2000 showed, with foreign forces on the outskirts of the city, Jerusalem is cut off from the rest of the country. To secure the country is to secure Jerusalem, and to abandon Jerusalem, whether by surrendering control over the road to Tel Aviv or by relinquishing Judea and Samaria, is to imperil the country. Specifically, placing foreign forces in Jerusalem or on its doorstep would mean importing Gaza into the heart of the country. Jerusalemites would find ourselves living in bomb shelters like our brothers and sisters in Sderot. Tel Aviv would find itself, like Ofakim, within range of enemy rockets. Terrorists with simple portable weapons could sit on the hills of Jerusalem and shoot down civilian jetliners landing at Ben Gurion Airport. In wartime, terrorists with primitive artillery could shut down the country's vital traffic arteries, preventing reservists from reaching the fronts in time to defend the state. And again, although inarguably accurate, Israel's security arguments for its sovereignty over Jerusalem have fallen on deaf ears. Neither the Americans, who demand that we cease asserting our sovereignty over eastern, southern, and northern Jerusalem, not to mention Judea and Samaria, nor the Arabs consider Jerusalem primarily a military issue. The Americans prefer to ignore the metaphysical and spiritual aspects of the city's frontline status as they push for an Israeli retreat to the indefensible 1949 armistice lines. For them, the issue of Jerusalem is no more than a petty real estate squabble. But our enemies know better. For them, the question of who controls Jerusalem is rightly recognized as the core issue, as the issue upon which Israel rises or falls as a state and as a people. Earlier this month, this point was made clearly by one of Israel's sworn enemies. In a television interview on May 7th, the PLO's ambassador to Lebanon, Abbas Zaki, explained that from the PLO to the Iranian mullahs, Jerusalem is seen as a metaphysical key to Israel's well-being. As he put it, with the implementation of the two-state solution involving an Israeli relinquishment of Jerusalem, in my opinion, Israel will collapse. Because if they get out of Jerusalem, what will become of all the talk about the promised land and the chosen people? What will become of all the sacrifices they made just to be told to leave? They consider Jerusalem to have a spiritual status. The Jews consider Judea and Samaria to be their historic dream. If the Jews leave those places, the Zionist ideal will begin to collapse. It will regress of its own accord. Then we will move forward. As a wayward Jew once said, the truth will set you free. We owe the likes of Zaki and the Iranians who call their most prestigious terrorist unit the Jerusalem Brigades a big thank you for reminding us of who we are and what we need to survive. For even as our leaders tried to forget what we as a people have always known, our history, both ancient and modern, is a testament to the truth of Zaki's statement. We mark the end of Jewish control over the land of Israel as having occurred not with the Roman invasion of 63 BCE, nor from the defeat of Bar Kokhba's rebellion 182 years later in 135. We mark the Churban, the destruction of our sovereignty, as having occurred with the fall of Jerusalem in 70. And why is this the case? It is because people do not fight for strategically significant hilltops. They fight for ideas like freedom. They fight for symbols, for abstractions like flags. They fight for their beliefs. They fight for their way of life. They do not fight for strategic advantage. We Jews know this better than any other people. We were the first people to self-consciously define ourselves at Mount Sinai as a nation committed to an abstract principle of an invisible God, an abstract code of law, and an abstract, yet-to-be-seen promised land. Joseph Trumpeldor is not remembered as a great hero for having said, "It is good to die for a strategically significant hilltop," although that is what he died defending. Trumpeldor is remembered as a great hero for having declared, "Tov lamut ba'ad artzenu," it is good to die for our country. Even further back, we remember that the only reason the kingdom of Judea did not suffer the same fate as the kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE is because as the 10 tribes of Israel were expelled into oblivion, King Chezkiyahu saved Jerusalem from the Assyrians. Due to his failed attempt to purge Judea of Assyrian influence, Chezkiyahu lost Lachish and Gat and dozens of other cities and villages and was forced to fall back on Jerusalem. There, against all odds, Chezkiyahu kept Jerusalem free. He breached the Assyrian siege by digging his famous water tunnel under the city. Assyrian king Sennacherib, who destroyed the kingdom of Israel and deported the 10 tribes, went home empty-handed from Judea. His conquest of all the other cities and villages meant little without Jerusalem. By saving Jerusalem, Chezkiyahu saved the Jewish independence, and through it, he saved the Jewish people. As Isaiah had promised in chapter 37, verses 32 to 35, "Ki miYerushalayim tetzeh she'arit, v'pleita mi'ar Tzion, kinat Adonai tzvaot ta'aseh zot, lachen כה אמר Adonai el melech Ashur, לא יבואו אל העיר הזאת, לא יורה שם חץ, לא יקדמנה מגן, ולא ישפוך עליה סוללה. בדרך אשר בא ישוב, ואל העיר הזאת לא יבוא, נאום אדוני, וגנותי על העיר הזאת, להושיעה למעני, ולמען דוד עבדי." From Jerusalem and Mount Zion, the people will be renewed. And so God said to the king of Assyria, "You will not enter this city. You will not shoot your arrows upon it. You will not breach its defenses. Your cannons will not reach it. You will go back the way you came. You will not enter this city." God decreed, I defended the city and saved it for me and for David, my servant. That's us. We're David, his servant. Our history as a people, both ancient and modern, has always been tied to Jerusalem. On Hanukkah, we remembered the Maccabean revolt in a very telling way. The Maccabees began their revolt against the Greeks in 167 BCE. The fighting lasted for 23 years until Yonatan was crowned king. But we remember the revolt for an event that occurred 2 years into the fighting. We celebrate the revolt not because it established the Maccabean dynasty. We celebrated because in 165, Yehuda Maccabee liberated the temple and so reinstated our sovereignty as a nation and our hope for national renewal. Again,